Hi there, my name's Maren Gamble. I'm a Health and Safety Management Systems Consultant in the core department with the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association. Today I'm here to walk you through a bit of an introductory session on our pre-assessment process, what goes into it, how to be successful, why we created it, and definitely the different features of the core audit that are necessary in a submission. In order to accomplish this, I'm going to be focusing on resources that are available on the IHSA website. They're available to access here through the core page if you click on Core 2020. And it's important for me to notice that I am, in fact, accessing this for the purposes of this session on February 16th, 2022. At any point in time, the resources on our website can and will be updated to reflect the most current information. So it's important that you're always checking back to get the most recent stuff based on the date that you're doing this. So the first thing I'm going to look at for our discussion today is actually this Core 2020 program guideline. If I click on it here under resources, I'm going to have the option to open up the PDF document. Again, this is going to be whatever's current at the time that you're on the website. My date today is February 16th, 2022, and this is the one that's current on this day. So when I open this up and I take a look, for our conversation today, I'm interested in talking about pre-assessment. So I'm going to actually navigate here to the section on pre-assessment in our guidelines. The pre-assessment is an official part of the core process. And what it is after you've submitted any internal submission to the IHSA for review, within the 60-day timeline that we commit to getting the full review back to you, there's an intermediate step. And that intermediate step is the pre-assessment, where our team is going to take an administrative look at the documents that you provide. Make sure that they're hitting the basic requirements of these guidelines, as well as the core handbook that's available. So we want to make sure that you've hit the scoring benchmarks, that you've filled out all the necessary pieces, that none of the folders are accidentally empty, that all the mandatory documents are provided. All of those basic sort of administrative features of the audit need to be in place. This was put in place so that we could catch, before it went to the full review, any of those things that could create a barrier for success based on the administrative front. So what was happening is that we would spend a lot of time trying to get clarification on missing pieces of information, or that clients would experience significant impacts to their score because things were left blank. So this is introduced in the interest of just making sure that we eliminate as much of that as possible before it gets into the detailed review. Since this was introduced to help capture those administrative sort of oopses that might have happened in a submission, we did also at the IHSA develop an internal process so that we could kind of systematically address that review and make sure that we're sort of looking for the same things from everybody and that everybody's getting that same quality checkpoint ahead of time. So, I tend to think of our pre-assessment process as falling into 3 stages. The very first stage, and has to come first, is basically checking your registration details. It's like checking your ID, making sure that the WSIB account number you provide matches up with the names, matches up with the people, matches up with what's in our system, just making sure that we're clear on exactly whose submission it is that we are looking at through the course of this review. So that has to come first. If there's any clarification around that, that's the first thing we're going to ask you for. Beyond that, once we're confident in your registration details and that we know who we're talking to, we move on to making sure that the mandatory items at a very high level are included. So we'll go through essentially the core checklist, make sure that all the things that are required are included in the package that you've provided, because if any of those mandatory documents are missing, that's again going to be something we need to reach out to you before we can move forward with the review. The third stage is where we actually start looking at the details of your audit tool. We look at the details of your evidence folders that you've provided to us, and we're making sure that nothing appears to be unintentionally blank, that there's no mismatch of verification methods, scoring is correctly entered. We're just going through and looking at those basic fundamental pieces of how the audit needs to be administratively put together. This is very high level at this point. We're not looking into the documents to see whether it's the right document, to see whether it's the right number of samples, anything like that. We're basically just making sure that a complete submission has been provided. Knowing what the pre-assessment process is a good first step, but as an internal auditor or senior manager for a firm that's going to be submitting to CORE, a really critical question is, how do I ensure that my organization is going to be successful at that pre-assessment process? In order to really address this in this session, I'm going to navigate away from the guidelines for a minute, back to the CORE 2020 resource page. On here is the CORE Audit tool. When I click on that, the CORE 2020 Audit tool, it's going to give me access to this Excel sheet that you can see here. It's got a cover page as the first tab, but the second tab here at the bottom, you can see on this gray tab, is called the Audit Information Form. This audit information form is really created to help firms provide all the required information that we're going to need for, honestly, most of both of those first two stages, where we're checking your identification, checking your registration, and we're looking at the core audit checklist, because the core audit checklist is actually at the bottom of this page. To take a look at the best ways to approach this, I'm going to go through and sort of make up an imaginary firm that does not exist to complete this form, and talk you through how I would approach completing this, as well as how I would approach pre-assessing this if you submitted it to us. The box in this top general information, all of these boxes, they provide us your basic contact information. This is your registration information. This is definitely at the heart of step one of our pre-assessment process. And it's critical that this information be correct so that we can move you forward through the process. What does it mean to have it correct? Well, the thing that is important to remember with that is that a core certificate is issued to WSIB accounts. It's not issued to sort of a company name or group of accounts. A core certificate is going to be issued per WSIB account. So when you're starting with your information in this form, the account number is really the critical place to start with that information. It's where we're going to start with the pre-assessment too. The name of your firm as a starting point is less critical than this number. This number is the starting point. So I'm making one up here for the purposes of our conversation. I clearly just hit my number pad. And so you'd enter your WSIB account number. If you don't have this, you're going to need to find out what it is for your firm. Similarly, your firm will have a WSIB firm number associated with it. And again, that's something that you need to figure out and make sure that you're able to provide for us accurately. This is something that is managed through the WSIB, so it's something you could contact your representatives there if you need some assistance with. After that, these numbers that are your identification, we can look at what your legal name is. So associated with the given account number, there will be a legal name that is attached to it through the WSIB. Again, this is WSIB based. So take a look at what your legal name is and make sure that you're providing it to us correctly spelled and in the same form that it would be found on the WSIB. Similarly, the company trade name needs to be provided, again, as registered through the WSIB. If you do not have a trade name registered through the WSIB, if it's sort of blank in their system, just use your legal name. Again, just retype the same thing. If you do have a trade name, you're going to include it here. And bear in mind that this is more of a secondary name for your company if this sort of thing exists. So for the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, our registered trade name is IHSA. This is not a reference to, if you do electrical work, that the trade you work in is electrical. So bear that in mind. As I mentioned, this has to match what the WSIB has for you. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull up the WSIB e-clearance website for us. And I'm going to do a quick search to show you what I mean in terms of how we would verify that for you. So here I am on the e-clearance website from WSIB, and I've just gone ahead and pulled up the IHSA's entry for the purposes of our conversation. You can see how here we do our search using your account number. So whatever account number you provided us, we're going to type that into the search bar and see what we get in terms of this profile entry for you. So for the IHSA, the legal name, as I mentioned, is here. The trade name is here. So those are the things that you would need to enter into that audit information form accurately. We would expect it to match what's in here. Notice there's also an official address on here, as well as a note about classifications and NAICS codes available here as well. So we're going to use this information as representative of the most current WSIB information for your firm that's available. So this is what we check against when you're submitting. I suggest you check this so that you know if there's any discrepancies and you can sort of get ahead of that before it comes into us and we ask you about it at pre-assessment. So I'm just going to go ahead and pause and complete the rest of this with some made up information so we can go to the next section. So you can see I populated just some fake information for the address for this firm. Again, this would want to match what was on the WSIB website for this firm. And if it doesn't, it's again something you're going to want to take a look at and provide extra clarification with your audit if it's an issue. I've also pre-populated for us pretend audit start date and end date. I'm going to pretend that today is the day that we're closing off our audit and that we've been working on it for a little over a month. Want to talk about two specific sections here that do need to be filled in and can be a little bit interesting. Right here is the type of audit. If you click on the cell here beside it, you'll notice it's actually a drop down. So if I click this little arrow, this little triangle here, it gives me the two possible choices. One is an initial internal audit. So this is if you're not certified, and it's going to populate a not applicable right below. The other option is if you are certified and it's an internal maintenance audit. When I do that one, it asks for your anniversary date. So if you have a certificate, you would pull that from your certificate. So again, just pick what's applicable to you when you send it in and make sure that if it needs an anniversary, you've put that in. Another section that I just want to talk about right here is the number of employees for this audit. This can be a bit confusing. Just think about it as, you know, when you had this opening meeting on January 11th, what was the number of people employed under this WSIB account specifically that you used to determine what your interviews were going to be. So the interviews, which we're going to talk about again, are based on your total number of employees. What was the number you used to make that choice? So I have a plan for this, so I'm just going to fill that in for now, and you'll see in a second. That brings us to the signatures section. This top part is your contact information. It's your registration information, and it is critical that it be signed off by the necessary people if we're going to update your account and enter you into our system. It's also critical that we have 3 representatives for your organization clearly identified, because these are going to be the people that we communicate with if there's confidential information for your firm. We do consider the majority, if not all, of the audit process confidential and highly private. The only thing we might talk to you more generally about is general questions about the core audit. How does this work? How does that work? But if we're talking about your organization, it's considered confidential. And the only people that we will divulge that information to are people who are officially registered for your firm. That's what this is about. So I'm going to go ahead and just fill this out, and I'll be right back for you guys. So I filled it out, again, completely arbitrary, made up stuff. There is a whole conversation around who should be in these different positions for your organization. There are 3 specific roles. That is a whole separate conversation that there are other resources on. So if that's a question, check out the other resources or email us to find out more information. But I'm going to fill those names in. The key here is noting that I did fill it out completely. At this point, the signature isn't filled in. I want to address the signature real quick. We do need it to be signed. It's not going to be enough for me to type a name in that box there and not have it be an official signature. The reason being, again, this is the official registration for your firm. This is approvals for divulging confidential information. So we need there to be those official signatures on there. There's different ways of doing this. You can insert a photo, an image in here into the file of the signature, or you can actually just leave it blank for now. And at the end of this whole process, print this form for everyone to actually sign by hand and then send us in a scanned copy. Regardless, we do need you to get that signature on the file when you send it in. Next, WSIB information. This is a section, it's the features of this section that you really need to be aware of, and then it becomes a little bit simpler to fill out. This top bar is in fact a drop down. So when you click on it, the little arrows there again, and you can pick your sector from here in terms of what you do. So for my example, I'll just pick construction. Once I pick construction, you'll notice that a lot of this pre-populated, and now it's more checkboxes than anything. And so before I filled this drop box in, it was a lot of blank, hard to fill out. Now that I've picked my general category, it's a little bit more clear. Bear in mind that this is going to be available information again through the WSIB e-clearance, so make sure that what you've selected matches. I'm going to go ahead and pause again and just fill out a little bit more. So I completed this. I'd like to draw your attention to a couple things. I left this designation as construction. I did check off a subclass. Just make sure you check off anything that's applicable to you. Should be at least one of them. And I've filled in this section here that talks about sort of additional notes. This is where you can write anything that's special, unique, that you need your auditor to know about your firm, and that gives us context for the review. So do take advantage of this. I see a lot of the times this is left blank, but it is an opportunity for you to tell us who you are. I decided for my made-up company here to describe them as a general contractor that's also involved in heavy equipment parts sales and snow removal, just for a little bit of a variety there in terms of what we're looking at. So I filled that in, and again, we're just going to compare that to WSIB and make sure that you align with what we're expecting. Up till here, I should say, before I go further, this is all that stage one that I was telling you about, verifying your registration, verifying your identification. From here, we can start getting into a lot of the details around that stage two, where we're making sure that you're meeting the mandatory requirements of your audit submission. This is where this fairly overwhelming looking section called the audit sampling plan can come into play. During that last pause, I went ahead and pre-populated a little bit of it. But what I would suggest is with this is it can look a little bit overwhelming to just kind of look at it all at once. Do just start sort of at the left and work towards the right and consider things one at a time. It does contain a lot of information and is intended to describe your whole audit in sort of one chart. So starting with this column here, work site locations, you're going to provide the site name and address of every location where you work. Do not forget your head office. So in terms of the general contractor aspect of this, I included 3 make-believe projects for this firm, but I've also included the head office here. I've actually, in this case, because I'm anticipating a little bit around what the audit plan is, I've broken the head office into 3 different functions. They have their primary office for the organization. They have a sales office, because as I mentioned, they're into heavy equipment parts sales. And they also have a shop and a yard for all of their snow removal equipment. So I'm separating that into it's really one location, but I'm going to describe it here as 3 separate things because I know that there's going to be separate interviews likely for those different locations, and I'm sort of anticipating that. So it is something that you can have a look at as you build yours, is what makes the most sense. In order to determine then, okay, so I mean, we put in the address, we put in the city, we put in the account, this is your WSIB account number. And this is just a list so far. The next thing we need to determine is what's going to be visited. The answer to what will be visited is a very important one to meet the minimum requirements of that core audit that we have in place. So what I want to do is just go back to our core resource page here. And this time I'm actually going to open the core audit handbook. Within the core audit handbook, it does specify for us the ratios that we're going to need for our observations. That's what this site visit concept is talking about. It's talking about your observations. So if I click on that observations link, it takes me to this chart. Notice the main office and shop must be included in addition to a sample of the work sites. So before I go any further, I'm going to say for the head office, yes, and I'm putting it beside each of these because even though I entered it 3 times, it's really one location. It's just different functions within that one location. So the head office shop is all being visited. Then I have 3 work locations to consider under the ratio here of this chart. So I look at the number of active sites. As I said, there were actually 3 active sites outside of the head office. So it tells us at least 2 sites must be visited. So I'll go back to my chart and I'll say, you know what, I'm going to visit these first 2. And that means I don't need to visit this last one. So at the end of the day, this breakdown is what I'm actually going to plan for my audit. It means that I won't be conducting observations at my Delta project here, but I will be conducting observations at all these other locations. If the ratio doesn't match what we expect, then we're going to be reaching out to you during the pre-assessment. The next conversation is about the employees. So when we're talking about total employees and planned number of interviews, this is really the conversation around meeting that interview requirement. So again, just like with observations, there is an expectation for interviews. And there's another chart for interview ratios to be carried out. You'll remember at the beginning of this sample, I indicated 37 employees. So that would be in this 26 to 50 range, which means we're looking for a total of 3 management supervisors and a total of 7 workers with to be interviewed, which is adding up to the total of 10 overall. Knowing that ratio, we're going to fill out this chart by first, in this first column, identifying how many people are actually in that location. So I'm going to just go ahead and fill this out for you on pause. Okay, so I've filled this out, basically just describing who is distributed where. I'm going to have a decent amount of management at the office. Everywhere else, I'm basically looking at there's one sort of supervisor in place. And then in each location, there's a number of workers available as well. What you'll notice with this, if I scroll down to the totals section, 9 management supervisors and 28 workers, it adds up to the total of 37. So that's where I said, like, the total number of employees is what you're representing here in terms of where they can be found. And this is what that number at the top is based on, is how many people did you have to consider during your audit sampling plan here. Now, that's the total number of employees that we declared here. This last set of columns is to declare how many you're going to interview at each location. Remember, we already determined our ratio. So let me go ahead and fill out a sample for this. All right, so I filled out a sample, basically looking at, I'll interview 1 manager at the head office there, maybe of the yard, maybe of one of the projects, and then some workers from the different locations. Generally, I don't plan to do any interviews at a location that I'm not doing observations, just because I'm not there. So that's why I've filled it out that way. But you'll notice that at the end of the day, here's the critical piece. I have identified 3 and 7 that I plan to do as part of this audit plan. Going here, this is a critical part of that stage 2, making sure you've met the mandatory requirements, because through here, we are understanding observation ratios are being met and interview ratios are being met. So that is a critical step to make sure it's filled out accurately and completely. So the next steps are mandatory completions on the audit information form that needs to be filled out correctly. There's an employment status attestation and an acknowledgement of our code of ethics. So for these, it is critical that you get the checkbox to check. It can be a little challenging at times to get the click on there, but do make sure you get there. Notice it turns green and the check shows up when you've got it. And again, fill out those names and titles and make sure that these are signed when you submit it. It is an important thing, again, to have an official signature, and it won't be considered complete until you do. I'm going to go ahead and just fill this out. All right, I filled that out. Same people as up top. It's important that it be consistent. And then I'm finally down to this bottom section, which is the audit submission checklist. So this lists all the mandatory submissions that need to come in. So all fields complete on the audit information form is what we've worked on together right now. Aside from that, you're going to be submitting all of these different things as part of your audit submission. And our e-file submission found on the website is kind of an important tool or can be a useful tool for also making sure that you do all of these things. So before I finish checking this, I'm just going to go over to the website and open up our e-file submission tool. It downloads as a series of zipped folders that you can get into and open up. In there, we've sort of already built in some of the key features that we're expecting to see. So if you look here, there's tools that for the interview questions and observation questions that are completely optional, but you can use during audit. And then there's this required submissions folder. These folders match this checklist here. So essentially, you're going to make sure that you've filled in a folder here. And then when you've filled it in, you'll create the check on each of these items in here. All right, notice I'm saving that last one for just a second. Right now, there's this red X at the bottom with a warning to say, make sure that your document is complete. When it is actually complete, it changes to this green check mark. So that's one thing you definitely need to look for to make sure that you've completed this fully. It will be looked for in the pre-assessment. If it's not a green check, it hasn't been filled out. It's a nice little double check for anyone doing it. You can save the audit. It tells us when it was saved, and then we can go from there. So at this point, essentially what we've done, as long as you've actually put all those documents in these folders, is you've ensured that stage 1 and stage 2 of your pre-assessment were successful. What I'm going to do now is just open up the tool again, get set up, and talk you through what stage 3 looks like, because we're almost done the pre-assessment. So for the last stage, we're actually going to look at the rest of the tool and a little bit at your evidence, but bear in mind, again, we're looking for completion, not actually assessing it at this point. So what we're going to do is make sure that you've filled in the score achieved box. If they're blank, that's an issue. Make sure you've filled in the auditor's notes box. If it's blank, it's an issue. Make sure that the auditor's notes you've provided actually relate to the correct verification method. If it doesn't match up, or if it's an and question and only one is provided, again, that's going to be an issue. Interviews are populated throughout the audit tool. If for some reason the interview ratios don't meet that ratio that you told us about on the audit info form, that's going to be an issue. If any of them are changing for some reason and there's no note about it, that's going to be an issue. If you've given yourself a partial score on an all or nothing question, that's an issue. If you've given yourself 3 out of 2, again, that's an issue. So we're just scanning through, looking for anything that we can see that's an issue in terms of how it's being completed or whether it's being completed. The other thing we'll do, and I'll just use the e-file here as a demonstration, is we're actually going to go through your supporting evidence. We're not going to open the specific files, but we are going to click on each folder to ensure that it's not empty. If we see a bunch of folders like this where it says this folder is empty, that's going to be a hint to us that maybe there was a technology issue, maybe the upload didn't go through. We want to make sure that there's no folders that are unintentionally left empty. If you've left them empty intentionally because it was not applicable or some other reason like that, that's fine. That's not a problem, but we're just trying to avoid any surprises at the review stage or at your next steps. So that's what we're going to do. Just go through, check your tool, check the folders, go through all the subfolders, make sure nothing looks like it was accidentally left blank. And with that, that's the pre-assessment. At that point, you'd be hearing from us to find out whether we ended up with a successful result and you'll be moving on to the next steps of the process, or whether any of these issues did come up, whether we need some clarification, some updates, or even a resubmission. If you do have any questions about any of this, or as you're going through, you're not sure how it applies to your firm, please always just reach out to us at core@IHSA.ca and we'll be happy to help you.